Well, hello. This is a K1300GT, and it's not my bike. It's not going to be my bike. It's actually a fellow I ride with, doing a little bit of work on the bike, and I asked him if I could keep it for a night just to do a review on it. If nothing else, some people might find it of interest. If you haven't bought a BMW sport touring bike, maybe you're looking at one of these. They don't make these anymore, obviously. They've been replaced by the K1600GT in, I think, 2011. But prior to the K1600, this was the big K bike that you could buy if you're into sport touring. Now, before I begin, I'd just like to say this bike's had a few modifications to it, which I'll point out. But just to give you a little history here, the 1300 GT replaced the 1200 GT. The bikes were very, very similar. There was a few changes. It was a mild evolution from the 1200 GT to the 1300 GT. The 1600 GT was a revolution. That was a whole different motorcycle. But the 1200 and the 1300 were very similar. The main thing being, they were the first big K touring bikes, the GTs, that moved the engine from a longitudinally mounted engine to a transverse mounted engine. In other words, in the early 2000s, BMW came out with a K1200 GT with a longitudinally mounted engine. In other words, the cylinders, they kind of poked out the side here. Actually, it was on the other side, I believe. Four-cylinder engine. And they were all in line, much the same as a rear-wheel drive car would be. However, in 2006, I believe, they changed to a transverse mounted 1200, and they drastically changed the design of the bike. So the early 2002 to 2005 models, little swoopier design, different look, whereas the 1200 GT in 2006 changed to this sort of, I call it the origami style, which I find very attractive. This is one that's got to be, in my opinion, and I realize looks are subjective, this has to be one of the prettiest motorcycles BMW ever made. Now, if you're into spotting these things, the easiest way to spot a 1300 from a 1200 is this big air vent in the side. Up until 2006, the 1200s had just one big slab of plastic here. Now these here creases, I think, add to the attractiveness of this bike. And one thing about the 1200s and the 1300s was the range of colors they came in. Some really, really cool metallic colors. There was smoked gray, pearled white. There was various shades of reds and oranges and metallics and deep, deep candied colored clears over top of them. Just beautiful motorcycles, in my opinion. Now, there was a lot of technology that came out with the 1200, 1300, the 2006 to 2010 models. One thing that BMW came out with was a high intense xenon headlight, high intensity discharge headlight. It was just in the low beam, which was common back then. In fact, it was common on their cars or automobiles as well. They would use low beam with xenon bulbs, and then they would use high beams in quite often a halogen. That's what they're doing here. This is actually a stacked headlight. Now when this first came out, I found this was an awkward cut here, but over time this design has aged very well. It actually looks very attractive. So the center beam here is the low beam. This particular bike has the xenon option in it. Actually, this bike has every option you can buy, I believe. And underneath are side-by-side two high beam halogen headlights. Here in Canada, we're required to run the low beam at all times. However, if you're in a jurisdiction where you're not required to do that, there's also two small running lights at the top here. So overall, you get 5 lights in that cluster. So of course, there's a center screen which has different menus to provide a lot of information, and very effective and simple set of clocks. And the standard issue big bore BMW switch block, the flash to pass and high beam trigger, the cruise control on and off, and then the paddle to set or resume, and the speed up and slow down. Very quick and easy. There's the menu button for the screen, a hazard button, windshield up and down, the automatic spin control, and the electronic suspension adjustment button, and of course your turn signals and horn. Now what is missing, of course, is the wonder wheel that is present on the new bikes. So on the other side we have controls for the heated seat and heated grips. This bike also has adjustable handlebars, which was very nice up or down, and the owner has actually installed a bracket for his iPhone mount to take up the extra space. The GT has the paralever front end with a parallelogram linkage up above versus the telelever like on the RT, but it does have the single-sided swing arm in the rear. So I took the bike out for a drive, very sporty bike. You find yourself spinning up through the gears because the engine does spin up quite quickly. It's a little more high strung, so it feels a lot sportier than the RT, the engine does anyway, and it pulls hard. Now I played with the windshield height at different speeds, and the windshield protection with this stock shield is not very good, especially with the high seat that the owner has on this bike. Up or down, it wasn't brilliant, but he's going to upgrade the windshield. Now the owner also installed some lowered pegs, which makes the ride very comfortable on your knees, but when I went to drag a knee in this particular corner, I was actually dragging one of the pegs long before my knee touched down, so that's something to consider if you're putting lowered pegs on your bike. So what do I think of this bike? Well, if you're coming off a Japanese sport tour, this would be probably the closest thing from the Germans that you can get, or most of the Europeans. It sounds like a big Japanese four-banger. The dash is tight in like a Japanese four-banger. That's something I do notice. The modern BMWs, the K16 and the new RT have a very broad dash. I don't know if it's dramatically broader than this, but this dash is tighter and it's closer, like two close clocks with a small screen in between. So if you're more of a minimalist dash person, this is closer to what you're looking at. I find aesthetically, as I mentioned earlier, this bike is very attractive and has aged very well. Very, very unique styling in my opinion. Performance-wise, it's very fast and it feels faster than my K16 did. It's a higher strung engine. I think the horsepower in this at the crank was touted by BMW to be somewhere in the vicinity of 165. Whereas the horsepower on the K16 I think is around 145. Now, anybody in the engineering world will tell you that horsepower numbers can be dramatically misleading. I think the K16 has a much higher torque, I think, than this bike. But this bike the engine feels sportier. Feels racier anyway. The K1300R and K1300S were the sport bikes that came out in tandem alongside of this bike back in those years, and they were very fast motorcycles. So this is very fast, very sporty. It's a little narrower through the body, so you have the perception that it's a smaller bike. Weight-wise and handling, it's comparable to my RT, very, very light and nimble. Anyway, the fellow who owns this is actually, I think he weighs about 260 pounds. He's 6'4", great big guy. And it pulls him along quite nicely, and he loves it. And why wouldn't you? There's a broad range of products available in the aftermarket for this bike, so it's good. On the buyer beware guide, like most BMWs, it seems that a lot of the different models that come out have things you should look out for if you're looking at buying one of these. One is the switch block failure. That was a common problem across the range in those years, those late, I don't know, from 2009 or 10, 11, 12, those years, and even into the newer ones. They'd have switch block failures. So all those cluster of buttons here, either on the left or right hand side, would fail. And it's almost usually always the left hand side because it's a much more, there are many more controls on that side. And the reason, the way you can tell if one's failing, the first thing to go typically is the electric windshield. So you go to press the button and nothing happens. That's something you should keep out for. BMW did a very good job of recalling a lot of those here in Canada. So this particular bike was actually recalled 2 years ago. It was bought by the fellow who owned it. He bought it used. this windshield didn't go up and down. He brought it into the dealer and they replaced that for free. That was great. Another issue with this particular bike, and according to the dealer it's a problem, is the ground strap. There's a failure or a fault that can occur with the ground. A very simple strip of wire that goes from the negative terminal of the battery to the frame of the bike. That failed as well. And according to the dealer, that is a common problem. That was actually, to the best of my knowledge, was not covered under warranty for this particular motorcycle, but it was only $165 fixed when it was done. Other than that, from a drive standpoint, I'm not aware of a problem with the rear drive of this bike, whereas I know the RT of this vintage, the 2008, 2009, 6, 7, those years of the RT, they did have rear drive failures. That was something you had to keep an eye out for. Basically, the oil would, or the seal would leak water in or oil out, it would dry out and fail, and you'd have to replace that. So aside from that, if you're looking at buying one of these, aside from those issues I mentioned, and I'm sure there's other people much more knowledgeable about that than I am, could fill you in on the various forums about what things to look out for. Generally speaking, with a BMW, if you're looking at buying a used one, you should make sure it's been serviced regularly, either by the owner, and talk in detail of exactly what he did or he or she did, or what products they used, oils and all those sorts of things. Check that stuff out. It's a good idea. Check the bike over yourself. If you get a chance, take one for a test drive. These are really nice motorcycles, and since they're used and a little long in the tooth now, you can get them relatively inexpensively compared to a new one. They're wonderful motorcycles. They serve very well. Anyway, until next time.